On December 20th, 1944, within the confines of Luxembourg City, the very telephone line seemed to sizzle with a fury held back by the thinnest of threads as General Omar Bradley clutched the receiver, his knuckles a stark white against the glossy black bakelite. Across that strained wire, Dwight Eisenhower's composed voice conveyed an order that would push their friendship to the absolute edge of its endurance. Two formidable American armies, the 1st and the 9th, were to be transferred to British authority, specifically to the command of Montgomery. "By God, I cannot be answerable to the American people if you make this happen," Bradley finally detonated, his famous Missouri composure shattering into pieces. "I resign." The Supreme Commander's retort was immediate, sharp, and cold. "Brad, it is I, not you, who is accountable to the American people. Your resignation, consequently, signifies absolutely nothing." Bradley hesitated, voiced a final, weak protest, and then submitted to a heavy silence. This single, charged moment, lost within the greater chaos of Hitler's Ardennes offensive, served as the culmination of 3 years of escalating American exasperation with a British Field Marshal who appeared obsessively driven to prove that he, and he alone, could win the war. Bernard L. Montgomery, the celebrated victor of El Alamein and a hero to the British people, had evolved into the most contentious personality within the Allied command structure. Yet, the question that echoed through American headquarters from the sands of Tunisia to the fields of Germany was more direct and far more damning. Why did a coalition, locked in a desperate struggle for survival against the tyranny of Nazism, find itself being fractured not by its common enemy, but by the abrasive character of a single man? The answer was not found in one isolated event but in a steady accumulation of moments, of choices, and of confrontations that had their beginnings in the dust of North Africa and their conclusion in the mire of Northwest Europe. This is the narrative of how a military genius transformed into a military liability, how the pride of a nation clashed with the necessities of an alliance, and how the Americans developed a perception of their most visible British battlefield commander that spanned a spectrum from sheer exasperation to something that bordered on absolute loathing. The arithmetic of the Allied command was, on the surface, deceptively straightforward, yet its political reality was deeply intricate. By the latter part of 1944, the number of American forces in Europe dramatically surpassed those of the British. America's industrial might dwarfed Britain's economy, which was stretched to its wartime limits. Despite these undeniable facts, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery seemed fundamentally incapable of recognizing these new realities or modifying his conduct to reflect them. Through American eyes, Montgomery was the embodiment of everything they had fought a revolution to break away from: an aristocratic sense of entitlement, a condescending colonial attitude, and an unwavering conviction in the inherent superiority of the British. Yet Montgomery was far from a simple caricature. He possessed a genuine brilliance, was painstakingly thorough in his preparations, and demonstrated a regard for the lives of his soldiers that deeply endeared him to his men. His victories were tangible, his skill in tactics beyond dispute. British soldiers, demoralized by the defeats of the early war, saw in Montgomery a leader who could deliver victories while keeping the list of casualties at a level they could bear. Churchill held him in high esteem. The British public idolized him. None of that, however, made a difference to the American commanders who consistently found themselves pushed to the side, treated with condescension, and publicly belittled by a field marshal who appeared to see them as little more than enthusiastic amateurs in dire need of British supervision. The source of the friction was not rooted in grand strategic disagreements, but in a matter far more intimate: respect, or the profound absence of it. From their initial meetings in North Africa to the final triumph in Germany, American commanders were to learn that Montgomery's way of treating them exposed a set of beliefs about American capability, American bravery, and American significance that inflicted a wound deeper than any mere battlefield dispute could. On March 6, 1943, at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, the desert air was thick with the bitter scent of incinerated machines and the stench of failure as Lieutenant General George S. Patton Jr. descended from his aircraft, arriving to take control of the deeply bruised II Corps. Just 20 days prior, German units under the command of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had brutally mauled American troops in their first significant clash with the seasoned Wehrmacht. The loss had been total, profoundly humiliating, and deeply educational. What Patton encountered was not just a command suffering from shattered morale, but a British command hierarchy that perceived American forces as untrustworthy auxiliaries who demanded close and careful management. General Sir Harold Alexander, the newly appointed British leader of the 18th Army Group responsible for all Allied ground forces in Tunisia, had composed an assessment of American combat effectiveness that read like a formal accusation. American leaders, it stated, were wanting in experience. American soldiers were wanting in discipline. American units would need substantial British oversight before they could be relied upon for any meaningful tasks. The assessment was not wholly without merit. The disaster at Kasserine Pass had indeed brought to light real weaknesses in American command, strategy, and the coordination of its different military branches. But Alexander's conclusion moved beyond constructive feedback. He believed that the two corps should be relegated to support functions while British armies carried out the main assaults. Patton grasped instantly what was truly on the line. This fight wasn't just about overcoming Rommel. It was about demonstrating that American military power could stand shoulder to shoulder with their British allies, as absolute equals. The entries in his personal diary from that time serve as a record of British arrogance, and his own resolve to affirm American value through decisive, aggressive combat. Montgomery, leading the British Eighth Army as it advanced on Tunisia from the east, was the very personification of the British attitudes that Patton so deeply detested. The victor of El Alamein projected the air of a commander who believed he had single-handedly turned Britain's fortunes in the Desert War. He had pursued Rommel across the vast expanse of North Africa with methodical, meticulously planned campaigns that prioritized overwhelming material advantage over flashes of tactical genius. His men had faith in him because he delivered victories without recklessly squandering their lives, but his demeanor implied that he was the sole master of modern warfare, and that everyone else, especially the Americans, had a great deal to learn from him. Alexander's operational strategy for the concluding Tunisian campaign was a direct reflection of these beliefs. Montgomery's Eighth Army was tasked with delivering the main assault against the Mareth Line, the network of Axis fortifications in southern Tunisia. Patton's Two Corps was to carry out diversionary attacks, pulling German focus away from Montgomery's primary push. The Americans were cast to act as Montgomery's protective screen while the British claimed the honor of the breakthrough to Tunis. From a military standpoint, the plan was sound. Montgomery was in command of battle-hardened troops with a history of success against German armor. Patton was leading formations that were still in the process of learning their craft. But the way the roles were assigned had consequences that reached far beyond tactical common sense. It solidified a set of expectations that would dog American commanders for the rest of the war. British forces would take the initiative, American forces would offer support, and British commanders would be showered with praise while American successes were either overlooked or deliberately downplayed. Patton initiated his offensive towards El Gueter on March 17, 1943, fiercely determined to validate American competence through sheer aggression. His directives were a mirror of his own character, blending tactical instructions with insistent calls for forceful leadership. Officers were commanded to lead from the very front lines. American soldiers were to exhibit the same fierce spirit that defined their entrance into the First World War. No matter the price, the Two Corps was to prove that it was a force worthy of being considered a combat equal, not merely an occupation army. The ensuing Battle of El Gueter was a moment of powerful vindication. On March 23, 50 German tanks from the 10th Panzer Division rolled out from mountain passes into the valley, launching a sunrise assault intended to crush the American defenses. What happened next was a profound shock to the German commanders. American artillery, positioned with meticulous care to create overlapping fields of fire, rained down a storm of devastating barrages on the approaching armor. Tank destroyers, placed to take full advantage of the terrain, engaged the panzers from distances that neutralized the German tactical edge. As the day drew to a close, the battlefield was a graveyard of wrecked German vehicles, and the 10th Panzer Division had been brought to a dead halt. For the very first time, American forces had decisively beaten experienced German armored units in a prolonged fight. Yet, the victory left a sour taste. Alexander's headquarters, its attention riveted on Montgomery's operations against the Mareth line, gave scant notice to the success of the two corps. British staff officers persisted in sending detailed directives to Patton, micromanaging American movements in a manner that betrayed a continuing skepticism about American competence. Even more offensively, Alexander repeatedly altered the objectives of the two corps, changing its priorities in ways that seemed deliberately calculated to keep American forces in a role subservient to British operations. Patton would receive orders to advance, then to stop, to attack with his tanks, then to lead with his infantry. Every new order threw American operations into disarray and reinforced the message that the two corps' main function was to support Montgomery's grand designs rather than to pursue and achieve its own independent goals. When Montgomery finally launched his attack on the Mareth line on March 20, his initial push gained very little ground against a resolute German defense. He adapted by redirecting his main force in a flanking movement, a display of the kind of adaptability that marked his most successful campaigns. However, this adjustment took precious time, giving German forces the chance to fortify new defensive lines. By the time the Eighth Army finally managed to break through, the chance for a swift and decisive pursuit had vanished. The two corps pressed on with its support attacks in central Tunisia, successfully luring German reserve units away from Montgomery's front. American troops made consistent progress, capturing their objectives and inflicting significant casualties on Axis forces. Yet these successes were almost entirely absent from British reports. Montgomery's breakthrough was the subject of widespread media attention. Patton's role, which was just as vital to the overall success of the campaign, was given only a passing mention. When the victory parade was conducted in Tunis on May 20, 1943, with General Eisenhower, Alexander, and the French General Henri Giroux all present to take the salute, the story that was told highlighted British and French accomplishments, while the American contributions were given only a brief, dismissive nod. For the American commanders, the lessons of Tunisia extended far beyond mere tactics and supply lines. They came to understand that to fight alongside the British was to be engaged in a struggle for recognition as well as for victory. They realized that Montgomery, regardless of his military gifts, appeared utterly unable to view American forces as true collaborators rather than as promising students. And they started to harbor the suspicion that this attitude wasn't just a quirk of Montgomery's personality, but a reflection of a wider British reluctance to concede that the balance of power within the alliance had permanently and decisively shifted in favor of Washington. These hard-won lessons would turn out to be prophetic as the Allies redirected their focus toward their next great objective, Sicily. On July 10, 1943, in the Gulf of Gela, Sicily, the most massive amphibious invasion in history up to that time moved toward the Sicilian coastline as Operation Husky. The assault on Italy's largest island began under the cover of darkness and tumultuous seas. More than 8 divisions, split between General Bernard Montgomery's British Eighth Army and General George Patton's American Seventh Army, assaulted the beaches stretching from Cape Scaramia to Syracuse, in an operation that would strain Allied cohesion just as much as it would challenge the German and Italian defenses. The strategy for Operation Husky had been a point of conflict from its very conception. The first drafts called for landings spread out across Sicily, aiming to capture ports swiftly to guarantee a steady flow of supplies for the operations that would follow. Montgomery loathed the idea of dispersed landings. His time in North Africa had ingrained in him the belief that concentrating forces was the key to victory, that spreading troops out was an open invitation to be defeated piece by piece. On April 24, 1943, he voiced his strong disapproval and put forward a different plan: focus all landings on the southeastern tip of Sicily, which would give the Eighth Army the unambiguous task of advancing directly to Messina, the island's northeastern port, and the direct route to mainland Italy. Air Marshal Arthur Tedder and Admiral Andrew Cunningham, the commanders of the air and naval forces respectively, were strongly against Montgomery's proposal. It would leave 13 Axis airfields still in operation, creating an intolerable level of danger for the invasion fleet. It would also force ships to cluster in a confined area of water, making them dangerously exposed to air attacks. Their counterarguments were substantial. Both were highly respected commanders who had earned their reputations through successful campaigns. Montgomery's reaction was a clear display of the sheer force of his personality. He declared, with the full support of Churchill, that he would rather resign than carry out a plan he saw as fundamentally defective. Confronted with a potential crisis that could have derailed the entire invasion, Eisenhower scheduled a conference for May 2 to settle the matter. That meeting laid bare the deep divisions that would only grow wider as the war continued. Montgomery argued his position with a self-assurance that bordered on sheer arrogance. Tedder and Cunningham countered forcefully, stressing the critical importance of the airfields and the safety of the naval forces. Eisenhower, caught in the difficult position of balancing military imperatives with the delicate politics of a coalition, ultimately came down on Montgomery's side. The landings would be concentrated in southeastern Sicily, with the 8th Army assigned the primary task of pushing toward Messina and the 7th Army given the mission of safeguarding the 8th Army's left flank. For Patton, who was reading the final plan in North Africa while readying his forces for the invasion, the message was crystal clear. The 7th Army was being cast in a supporting part. Montgomery was to be the star of the show, leading the main assault. The British were slated to capture Messina while the Americans were tasked with watching their backs. Once more, American forces found themselves shunted into secondary roles as British commanders chased after all the glory. This decision was galling for reasons that went far beyond Patton's own considerable pride. By July of 1943, the American military presence in the Mediterranean had expanded significantly. The 7th Army was a massive force, consisting of 3 infantry divisions, an armored division, and a vast number of support troops, making it comparable in sheer size to the 8th Army. The factories of American industry were churning out a flood of equipment for the Allied forces. American air power held undisputed control of the Mediterranean skies. And yet, the command hierarchy continued to treat American forces like auxiliary units, to be used as the British saw fit. Patton's diary entry from July 12 captured his intense frustration with raw clarity. Alexander and his all-British staff had paid a visit to the 7th Army headquarters to lay out the operational plan, a plan that, in Patton's estimation, completely blocked the Americans from any chance of taking Messina. He recorded with deep bitterness that Alexander, despite being in command of both British and American armies, had arrived with not a single American officer on his staff. "What fools we are," Patton wrote, acknowledging that American political leaders had acquiesced to a command structure that made American marginalization an absolute certainty. The landings themselves proceeded with reasonable success, in spite of chaotic airborne operations that resulted in British and American paratroopers being strewn across the landscape, with many tragically drowning when their gliders went down in the Mediterranean. By the light of dawn on July 10, both armies had established secure footholds on the beaches and were beginning their push inland. The initial opposition from the Italian coastal divisions dissolved with surprising speed. German counter-assaults against Gela Beach, where Patton's troops had come ashore, were repelled thanks to the powerful support of naval artillery and the fierce resistance of the 1st Infantry Division. Montgomery, operating under the conviction that the Axis resistance would soon crumble under the weight of methodical British pressure, informed Alexander that the path to Messina was now clear. His 8th Army would push directly up the eastern coastline. Patton's 7th Army was to maintain a defensive stance, shielding the 8th Army's flank as Montgomery went after what he believed would be a broken and fleeing enemy. The message was a window into Montgomery's core assumptions. British forces were destined to land the decisive blow, while American forces were there to provide a safety net. Reality, however, quickly intervened. The German forces, far from breaking, dug in and established formidable defensive lines, masterfully using Sicily's rugged, mountainous landscape to their advantage. The advance of the 8th Army came to a grinding halt south of Catania, where German paratroopers were entrenched in positions that funneled the British attacks into deadly, pre-sighted kill zones. Montgomery's systematic style, which had been so potent in the open desert, proved to be far less effective against defenders who could mass their strength on constricted fronts and fight from well-prepared fortifications. On July 12, with the Eighth Army's forward momentum completely stalled, Montgomery dispatched a message to Alexander that would come to define the Anglo-American relationship for the rest of the war. He suggested that the Eighth Army should broaden its operational zone to the west, a move that would effectively seize control of a crucial road that had been allocated to the Seventh Army. This wider front, he argued, would enable him to outmaneuver the German positions that were obstructing his advance. American forces, he proposed, should cease their movements and hold their ground while the Eighth Army carried out the offensive that would slice Sicily in two. The tone of the message was just as telling as its substance. Montgomery wasn't asking for Alexander's permission. He was notifying Alexander of his plans and recommending that the American forces simply adapt. The level of presumption was breathtaking. Montgomery was essentially proposing to take over American operational territory, demote American forces to a purely defensive role, and implement a strategy that guaranteed that British forces, and British forces alone, would receive the acclaim for conquering Sicily. Alexander, whose deep respect for Montgomery was stronger than his belief in the American commanders, consented. On July 13, he put out an order that handed the contested road over to Montgomery and directed Patton to maintain a defensive posture while the Eighth Army pushed forward. For the American commanders who read that order, the implication was impossible to miss. British desires would dictate Allied strategy, no matter the extent of American involvement or the proven capabilities of their forces. Patton's immediate reaction was a testament to the political shackles that so often frustrated American commanders throughout the war. In spite of the rage he vented in his diary, where he likened Montgomery to an egotistical diva and Alexander to a fawning, incompetent yes-man, Patton officially complied with the order without any outward sign of protest. He was acutely aware that Eisenhower, as the overall commander of Allied forces in the Mediterranean, could not tolerate an open rebellion from his subordinate commanders. The nature of coalition warfare demanded compromise and concession, even when that compromise meant choking down justifiable anger. But Patton had absolutely no intention of letting the Seventh Army languish in inactivity while Montgomery chased after victory. If Alexander was not going to give the Americans a primary objective, then Patton would forge one for himself. He flew to Alexander's headquarters on July 17, armed with a map and a new proposal. Instead of passively holding a defensive line, the Seventh Army would launch an offensive to the northwest, towards Palermo, the capital and main port of Sicily. This move would cut the island in two, and snare the Italian forces located in western Sicily, and capture vital port facilities that would significantly alleviate the American supply problems. Alexander, perhaps taken aback by Patton's show of initiative, or maybe just relieved to see American aggression channeled away from Montgomery's operations, gave his approval. That one decision completely reshaped the Sicily campaign. Instead of a lone British advance up the eastern coast with American forces providing defensive cover, the Allies would now be conducting two distinct drives. Montgomery would persist in his push towards Messina from the south and east. Patton would make a dash for Palermo, then swing east to drive towards Messina along Sicily's northern coast. What had started as a strategic modification quickly morphed into a deeply personal contest. Patton, dead set on showcasing American capabilities and determined to get to Messina before Montgomery, pushed his command with his trademark ferocity. The Seventh Army advanced with a velocity that stunned both its allies and its adversaries, navigating through difficult terrain at a pace that Montgomery's methodical style could never hope to achieve. A mere 12 days after their initial landing, American soldiers marched into Palermo on July 22, seizing Sicily's largest city and a crucial port. Montgomery, in the meantime, was still laboriously grinding away at the German defenses south of Mount Etna. His advance was steady, professional, and becoming increasingly disconnected from the campaign's final outcome. The German forces, having accepted that Sicily was a lost cause, had already started to organize their evacuation to the Italian mainland. The question was no longer about whether the Allies would conquer Sicily, but which of the Allied armies would be the first to reach Messina and lay claim to the symbolic victory. The race to Messina became a test of character as much as of military competence. Patton drove the 7th Army to the very brink of its endurance, demanding a relentless forward push regardless of the obstacles or the cost in lives. His corps commanders, well versed in his methods, pushed their divisions with equal intensity. American engineers worked with astonishing speed to repair roads and bridges. American infantrymen marched through blistering heat and over mountainous terrain at a rate that left their support units desperately trying to keep up. Montgomery's 8th Army, contending with stiffer resistance on more challenging ground, moved forward in its customary methodical fashion. British commanders, conditioned to keep casualties to a minimum and to conserve their resources, were unwilling to take unnecessary risks in a mere pursuit of speed. The difference highlighted the core distinctions between the American and British military philosophies. The Americans, with their vast reserves of manpower and immense industrial power, could afford to take tactical gambles and sustain heavy losses. The British, who had been fighting since 1939 with a shrinking pool of soldiers and a depleted economy, simply could not. But the race was also a matter of personal pride. Montgomery's public declarations and private letters made it clear that he viewed the 8th Army's task as more critical and far more arduous than the 7th Army's operations. The American success in capturing Palermo, from Montgomery's viewpoint, was of no real significance. Patton had only contended with weak Italian resistance in a secondary sector. The 8th Army, on the other hand, was facing off against seasoned German troops in defensive positions that heavily favored them. The comparison Montgomery was hinting at was, in his mind, completely invalid. American commanders interpreted Montgomery's belittling of their accomplishments as yet another example of typical British condescension. They had been subjected to similar evaluations back in Tunisia. American victories were downplayed. American struggles were attributed to a lack of experience. American commanders were treated like enthusiastic but untrained novices. This prevailing attitude strongly suggested that any respect the British had for American military prowess was entirely conditional, offered only when American forces were functioning under British command, following British guidance, and serving British goals. On August 17, 1943, units from Patton's 3rd Infantry Division marched into Messina, arriving several hours before the British forces. The 7th Army had emerged victorious in the race, but it was a hollow triumph, one that mirrored the deeply dysfunctional state of the Allied command's relationships. Montgomery's public response was a mix of superficial politeness and subtle disdain. He offered his congratulations to Patton, but at the same time, he made sure to stress the challenges the 8th Army had contended with, implying that it was the terrain, not superior competence, that had dictated the results. The British media's portrayal of the events echoed Montgomery's narrative. Their reports lauded the 8th Army's struggle against the Germans, while depicting the 7th Army's advance as a minor sideshow against a lesser foe. American accomplishments were mentioned, but they were consistently minimized, framed as supplementary to, rather than on par with, the British operations. For the American commanders who read these reports, the message was stark and clear. British accounts would invariably put British achievements at the forefront, regardless of the objective facts. The Sicily campaign inflicted wounds that would never completely mend. American commanders had proven that their forces were a match for British troops in both operational speed and combat prowess, yet the acknowledgement they received from their British counterparts remained reluctant and conditional. Montgomery, especially, seemed constitutionally incapable of admitting that American commanders could possess skills equal to his own, or that American forces might be deserving of credit that matched their contributions. Two particular incidents during the Sicily campaign further soured the already strained relationships. On August 3, and then again on August 10, Patton physically struck hospitalized soldiers whom he accused of cowardice, setting off a scandal that would cast a long shadow over his career. When the news of this reached Montgomery, his reaction was one of cold contempt. He saw Patton's actions as a confirmation of British beliefs about American lack of discipline and emotional instability. A British commander, Montgomery implied, would never lose his composure in such a manner. The The second event centered on a young British lieutenant whom Montgomery had sent to Patton's headquarters to act as a liaison officer. The lieutenant showed up with a suitcase fastened with a piece of string, a disheveled look that infuriated Patton. Previously, Patton had dispatched a full liaison team to Montgomery, which included a colonel, a major, and an entire communications unit. In return, Montgomery had sent a single junior officer with substandard equipment. Patton sent the lieutenant back with a message stating that he would not have boys in his headquarters. While the incident was small, almost laughable, it perfectly encapsulated the casual lack of respect that was typical of Montgomery's dealings with his American peers. Patton was in command of an army that was equal in size to Montgomery's 8th Army. By any professional standard, he was entitled to liaison officers of a suitable rank and competence. Montgomery's failure to provide them indicated that he saw the 7th Army as a subordinate entity, irrespective of the official command structure. As the Allied strategists shifted their focus to the invasion of Italy and, ultimately, to Operation Overlord, the cross-channel assault on France, one thing had become undeniably clear. Bernard Montgomery saw himself as the supreme Allied battlefield commander and, as such, he anticipated that his American subordinates would defer to him. The fact that American commanders were increasingly seeing Montgomery as the main impediment to a true Anglo-American partnership seemed to be something that the British Field Marshal either failed to notice or simply did not care about. On September 1, 1944, in northern France, the Allied breakout from Normandy had completely demolished the German defenses in France, forcing Wehrmacht units into a chaotic, headlong retreat towards the east. Paris had been joyfully liberated on August 25, 1944, in a celebration that seemed to signal the war was rapidly approaching its conclusion. From the beaches of Normandy all the way to Belgium, Allied armies were chasing a defeated enemy across lands where, only a few months before, the German military had seemed invincible. The prospect of victory, perhaps even by Christmas, felt tantalizingly close. For Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who had recently been promoted and was reveling in the success of the Normandy campaign, this was a time for decisive, audacious action. He had been in command of all Allied ground forces during the Normandy invasion, a role that, when combined with his earlier triumphs in North Africa and Sicily, cemented his position as Britain's most celebrated battlefield commander. Now, with the German armies in complete disarray, Montgomery perceived a chance to bring the war to an end with a single, conclusive offensive. But September 1st also marked a transition that Montgomery deeply and openly resented. General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, took over direct command of all Allied ground forces. This meant that Montgomery, who had held operational authority over both American and British armies during the Normandy campaign, was now demoted to the command of the 21st Army Group, which consisted of the British and Canadian forces in Northwest Europe. His American counterpart, General Omar Bradley, was now leading the 12th Army Group, a massive force that included the American 1st, 3rd, and 9th Armies. The change in command was an unavoidable consequence of the shifting realities of the war. The number of American troops in Europe now far exceeded the combined forces of the British and Canadians. The entire Allied operation was sustained by American logistics. The skies over Europe were dominated by American air power. The material backbone of the Allied victory was provided by American industrial might. The political situation demanded American leadership of a coalition that had become, in its makeup, overwhelmingly American. Montgomery was aware of the political reasons, but he accepted neither the rationale nor its consequences. He believed that splitting command authority across several headquarters would weaken the decisive leadership that was essential for victory. In his view, Eisenhower, for all his political acumen, did not have the necessary battlefield experience to effectively manage ground operations. The role of the Supreme Commander, Montgomery contended with growing insistence, should be confined to handling political and logistical matters. The operational command, he argued, should be kept in the hands of a single ground forces commander, someone who possessed Montgomery's own proven track record on the battlefield. The one person who stood to gain from this proposal was, quite clearly, Montgomery himself. Yet, the Field Marshal framed his argument as a matter of military imperative rather than personal ambition. He insisted that Eisenhower's intended strategy of advancing into Germany along a wide front, with several armies attacking at the same time, was strategically flawed. He argued that it would spread their resources too thin, hinder any chance of a decisive concentration of force, and all but ensure that the war would extend into 1945. Montgomery's proposed alternative was, in typical fashion, both daring and self-serving. He suggested that instead of a broad front attack, the Allies should pool their forces for a single, overwhelming thrust into northern Germany. This offensive would cross the Rhine, capture the industrial heartland of the Ruhr, and then drive on to Berlin before the German forces had a chance to mount a cohesive defense. It was a given, in his mind, that Montgomery would be in command of this decisive operation, with American forces assigned the supporting roles of providing assistance and guarding his flanks. The military soundness of this proposal was open to question. A narrow, deep penetration into Germany would result in a long, exposed salient that would be highly susceptible to counterattack. It would mean halting operations in other areas, which would allow the Germans to concentrate their forces against the main advance. The plan's success hinged on capturing bridges undamaged and keeping supply lines open over hundreds of miles of hostile territory. At its core, it was based on the assumption that German resistance had so thoroughly collapsed that a rapid advance would meet with little to no opposition. But the political ramifications of the proposal were impossible to ignore. Montgomery was essentially asking American political leaders to place their armies under British command for an operation that was designed to ensure that British forces, led by a British commander, would deliver the final, decisive blow to end the war. He was asking for American soldiers to serve as his shield while he, the British Field Marshal, achieved the ultimate victory. And he was, in essence, demanding that Eisenhower relinquish operational control to a subordinate who made no effort to hide his disdain for the Supreme Commander's strategic thinking. Eisenhower, in his ongoing effort to navigate the complex interplay of military needs and coalition politics, chose a middle ground. He would not commit all of his forces to Montgomery's northern offensive, but he would grant Montgomery precedence for supplies and approve a more limited operation aimed at seizing the bridges over the Rhine in the Netherlands. This plan, which was given the code name Operation Market Garden, would deploy 3 airborne divisions to capture the bridges at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem. British ground forces would then make a rapid advance over these captured bridges, secure a bridgehead across the Rhine, and get into position for future operations into Germany. For the American commanders, especially Bradley and Patton, Montgomery's latest plan was a confirmation of their deepest fears. They saw the Field Marshal once again trying to push American forces into supporting roles while British troops took the spotlight. He was demanding supplies that could have been used to fuel American advances in central France. And he was advocating for an operation whose potential risks seemed completely out of proportion to its possible rewards. Patton, who was commanding the Third Army as it pushed towards Germany through eastern France, was livid when he discovered that fuel supplies were being redirected to Montgomery. His army had clearly shown during August that aggressive American operations could move faster and cover more ground than the cautious movements of the British. The Third Army was getting close to the German border and the Rhine River. Yet, Eisenhower was bringing American operations to a halt in order to supply a British Field Marshal whose past performance suggested a preference for methodical caution over operational audacity. Bradley, who was usually more tactful than Patton, felt the same frustration as his subordinate. Montgomery would demand resources, warn of terrible outcomes if they were not provided, and then be given priority, regardless of American requirements or successes. Bradley understood that the politics of coalition warfare made it certain that British requests would always be given a sympathetic ear, even as American forces were providing the vast majority of the Allied combat strength. On September 17, 1944, in the Netherlands, Operation Market Garden began with the largest airborne assault in history. Over 35,000 American and British paratroopers were dropped from transport planes and glided into the fields of Holland, with the mission of capturing bridges before the German forces could rig them for demolition. British ground troops, spearheaded by the XXX Corps, started their advance north along a single road, racing against time to reach the airborne units before German counterattacks could overwhelm them. The operation ended in a complete and utter failure. Intelligence had spotted German armored units in the vicinity of Arnhem, the most distant objective, but these critical warnings had been ignored. The airborne troops were dropped too far from their target bridges, giving the Germans ample time to set up a defense. The single road of advance turned into a deadly corridor, where British armor was unable to move quickly or maneuver off the road, which was hemmed in by marshy ground. German resistance, which was expected to be collapsing, instead grew stronger as Wehrmacht commanders quickly grasped the danger and diverted reinforcements to the area. At the Arnhem Bridge, British paratroopers under the command of Lieutenant Colonel John Frost held on to one end of it against impossible odds for days, desperately awaiting a relief force that would never arrive. The XXX Corps, brought to a standstill by German counterattacks and unable to find a way around destroyed bridges, never made it to Arnhem. By September 25, when the operation was finally called off, more than 17,000 Allied soldiers had been killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. This grim toll included approximately 6,400 paratroopers who had landed at Arnhem, most of whom were now either dead or in captivity. The failure was absolute. The Rhine had not been crossed. The German defenses in the Netherlands were now stronger than ever. The Allied momentum, which had seemed so unstoppable at the beginning of September, had been squandered in the fields of Holland and along a road that the British would later dub Hell's Highway. And the chance to end the war in 1944 had vanished in what would be remembered as Montgomery's most disastrous error. The American reaction was a mixture of vindication and fury. Both Patton and Bradley had been against Market Garden from the start, contending that its risks far exceeded its potential rewards. They had argued that the resources being funneled into Montgomery's plan would be more effectively used to sustain the American advances towards Germany. Their concerns had been brushed aside, overridden by political considerations and Montgomery's unwavering self-assurance. Now, with the failure of Market Garden being an undeniable fact, the American commanders felt they had a right to some measure of satisfaction in seeing their judgment proven correct. But any sense of satisfaction was completely overshadowed by their rage at Montgomery's handling of the disaster. Instead of taking ownership of an operation that he had conceived, planned, and led, Montgomery described Market Garden as being 90% successful. He pointed out that the bridges at Eindhoven and Nijmegen had been captured. He noted that Allied forces had succeeded in liberating a significant portion of Dutch territory. The fact that Arnhem, the operation's main goal, had not been achieved was framed as a minor hiccup in an otherwise victorious campaign. The audacity of this claim was simply staggering. The entire purpose of Market Garden was to create a bridgehead over the Rhine. This objective had not been met. The operation had resulted in over 17,000 casualties for absolutely no strategic advantage. Yet here was Montgomery, declaring a victory, twisting failure into success through the sheer power of his own personality. The American commanders saw this for exactly what it was. Montgomery was protecting his own reputation at the expense of the truth. When Montgomery was successful, the credit was his and his alone. When his operations ran into trouble, the reasons always involved a lack of resources, insufficient support, or the mistakes of others. The notion of personal accountability for failures was glaringly absent from Montgomery's version of events. But Montgomery's most unforgivable act was yet to come. In the wake of Market Garden, as the Allied advance shifted to a slow, grinding battle against reinforced German defenses, Montgomery started to openly criticize Eisenhower's strategy. He argued in statements to the British press and in messages to Churchill that the broad front approach had thrown away the chance for a decisive victory. If only his plan had been fully implemented, if only he had been given the resources and the authority he had asked for, the war would already be over. This criticism conveniently overlooked some very inconvenient facts. Montgomery had been given a substantial amount of resources for Market Garden. The operation's failure was the result of poor planning, intelligence oversights, and a gross underestimation of German strength, not a lack of support. But in Montgomery's retelling, his own operational blunder was transformed into a squandered opportunity, supposedly brought about by the strategic short-sightedness of others. For the American commanders, Montgomery's deflection was the final confirmation that the field marshal would never admit to a personal mistake. Every failure was recast as someone else's fault. Every success was presented as his own triumph. This consistent pattern hinted at more than just vanity. It suggested something far more destructive, a deep-seated inability for honest self-reflection that made Montgomery a threat to Allied unity, even as his tactical abilities remained a valuable asset. On December 16, 1944, in the Ardennes forest of Belgium, at the break of dawn, German forces unleashed their final major offensive in the west. They attacked through the Ardennes in a desperate, last-ditch effort to divide the Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. The assault caught the Allies completely by surprise, crashing into thinly defended American lines and creating a large bulge in the front that would lend the battle its famous name. For 10 critical days, the fate of the battle was uncertain as German armored columns pushed towards the Meuse River, posing a serious threat of shattering the Allied defenses and dragging the war on indefinitely. He acknowledged that the British forces had played a supportive role, as partners in a coalition should. The speech was a necessary act of diplomacy, a correction of Montgomery's narrative, and an admission of the military facts. But it also signified Britain's acceptance that the final campaigns of the war would be predominantly American-led initiatives. British forces would still be involved, they would contribute, and they would share in the final victory. But from that point on, American commanders would increasingly be the ones to set the strategy, direct the operations, and receive the credit that the dominance of their forces warranted. Montgomery, now isolated by his own actions and becoming less relevant to operations that were overwhelmingly American, spent the last months of the war in command of the 21st Army Group in Northern Europe. His military operations were conducted with professionalism. His tactical judgment was as sharp as ever. But his relationship with the American commanders was broken beyond repair. Bradley made a point of avoiding him. Patton held him in utter contempt. Eisenhower put up with him as a political necessity, but he never again placed his trust in Montgomery's judgment or his intentions. On May 8, 1945, Germany offered its unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was finally over. The victory was the achievement of an Allied coalition that had triumphed not only over Nazi Germany but also over the internal conflicts that had constantly threatened to tear it apart. In the initial joy of peace, the old disputes were momentarily forgotten. Montgomery was showered with praise by a thankful British public. The American commanders came back home to massive celebrations that honored their accomplishments. But in the memoirs and historical accounts that were written after the war, the old conflicts resurfaced. Montgomery's own memoirs, published in 1958, reignited the old debates by criticizing Eisenhower and suggesting that his own strategic plans had been superior. Eisenhower, who was then the President of the United States, cut off all personal communication, refusing to engage with a former colleague who seemed obsessed with reliving the battles of a long-gone war. Bradley's memoir, which came out in 1951, provided a detailed account of the instances where Montgomery's actions had damaged Allied operations. Patton's diary, published after his death, laid bare the sheer depth of his disdain for the British Field Marshal. American histories of the war, using these personal accounts and official documents, have generally portrayed Montgomery as a commander who was talented but difficult, brilliant but unbearable, a leader whose contributions were undeniable but whose personality made him a liability in a coalition war. British historians have often defended Montgomery, asserting that the American commanders failed to appreciate his systematic approach, his deep concern for minimizing casualties, and his strategic genius. They highlight the fact that Montgomery never lost a significant battle after he took command in North Africa. They stress that his meticulous planning and preparation were key to the success of D-Day. They suggest that the American criticisms were rooted in a jealousy of British military professionalism and a resentment of their long-standing traditions. The arguments have raged on for decades, long after the main figures had passed away. Historians have debated Montgomery's actual contributions, whether the American frustrations were warranted, and how much personal dynamics influenced military campaigns. Some have come to the conclusion that Montgomery was a superb commander who was simply not cut out for coalition warfare. Others have proposed that the American commanders, who lacked Montgomery's extensive experience, were resentful of his superior judgment. And still others have argued that the clashes were just the unavoidable frictions that arise when proud nations try to work together in a fight for their very existence. But underlying all the historical debates is a more straightforward reality, one that the American commanders of the Second World War understood with perfect clarity. Bernard Montgomery, despite all his abilities, was incapable of seeing American forces as his equals. Whether this inability stemmed from personal arrogance, cultural bias, or a British resolve to cling to a fading sense of supremacy is a matter for debate. What is beyond dispute is that Montgomery's behavior poisoned the relationships within the Allied command and erected needless barriers to effective coalition warfare. The American experience with Montgomery taught them lessons that would resonate long after the war was over. Future coalition operations would be designed in a way to keep personality clashes from sabotaging military effectiveness. Command structures would be set up to guarantee fair representation and to prevent any single nation from taking control simply through sheer self-confidence or historical reputation. And the American military culture would develop a deep-seated weariness of allies who mistake partnership for subservience. To the Americans who served alongside Montgomery, from the deserts of Tunisia to the fields of Germany, the Field Marshal symbolized what they believed they had cast off in 1776. The notion that American strength must be guided by British wisdom, that colonial zeal needs metropolitan sophistication to be successful, that the energy of the New World requires the experience of the Old World to prevent disaster. They found that even battlefield prowess, industrial power, and military success were not enough to overcome cultural biases that were deeply ingrained in centuries of British global dominance. Montgomery never grasped this. Until his death in 1976, he insisted that his actions during the war had been correct, his criticisms valid, and his strategic thinking superior to all others. He remained steadfast in his belief that Eisenhower's leadership had been lacking, that the American commanders did not possess his level of professional skill, and that the war could have been concluded much earlier if only his advice had been taken. The American commanders who outlived him offered a different assessment. They acknowledged Montgomery's tactical acumen but had serious doubts about his strategic judgment. They commended his thorough preparations but also pointed out that wars are won through boldness as well as through caution. They admitted his concern for casualties but also noted that Montgomery's caution sometimes gave the enemy the opportunity to escape and fight another day. And they concluded, with almost complete agreement, that Montgomery's personality made coalition warfare far more challenging than it needed to be. The ultimate judgment came from Eisenhower, writing many years after the war. He recognized Montgomery's skills but also highlighted the Field Marshal's utter failure to comprehend the political nuances of leading a coalition. Montgomery, Eisenhower concluded, was a man whose military talents were unquestionable, but whose lack of diplomatic tact made him unfit for high command in Allied operations. It was, perhaps, the most damning critique of all, not that Montgomery was militarily incompetent, but that his strengths were nullified by flaws that weakened the very cause he was fighting for. In a coalition war, where personality can be as impactful as tactics or strategy, Montgomery's inability to treat his allies as partners made him not just difficult, but dangerous. The Americans learned this lesson through a series of bitter experiences. From the sands of North Africa to the mud of Germany, they came to understand that military alliances are built on more than just having a common enemy. They require mutual respect, a recognition of each partner's contributions, and a readiness to put personal ego aside for the sake of a collective goal. Montgomery, whatever his other virtues may have been, was unable to meet these fundamental requirements. And in that very failure lies the answer to why the Americans hated Monty. It wasn't because he was British, or because he was cautious, but because he made them feel like colonial support troops in a war that they themselves were winning, soldiers whose blood was valued, but whose judgment was not, allies who were appreciated only to the extent that they could contribute to British glory. That is a memory that has outlasted Montgomery, outlasted the generation that served with him, and even outlasted the Cold War alliance that emerged from that wartime partnership. It stands as a timeless reminder that technical skill is no replacement for human respect, and that brilliance on the battlefield is worth very little if it alienates the very people whose cooperation is essential for victory. Bernard Montgomery was a great many things: a brilliant tactician, a careful commander, and a British hero. But to the Americans who fought beside him, he was also a cautionary lesson about the limitations of military genius when it is separated from diplomatic wisdom. The issue was never whether the Americans recognized Montgomery's talents. They certainly did. The issue was whether Montgomery could ever recognize theirs. He could not. And in that single failure of imagination were the seeds of a bitterness that no amount of shared victory could ever truly erase.